The morning of December 8, 1941, Philippine time, brought more than war to Clark Field. Among the wreckage of America's forward air power in the Pacific lay something Japanese engineers had never expected to examine up close. A Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The aircraft, tail number 40-3097, had been caught on the ground during the devastating Japanese attack that destroyed much of America's Philippine-based bomber force. What Japanese technical intelligence teams discovered when they examined this aircraft would fundamentally challenge their understanding of American aircraft design philosophy and reveal assumptions about aerial warfare that would haunt Japanese aviation throughout the Pacific War. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The B-17 that Japanese engineers began examining in the days following the Clark Field attack represented the culmination of American strategic bombing doctrine developed throughout the 1930s. But it also embodied design decisions that stood in stark contrast to Japanese aviation philosophy. The aircraft was a fortress in more than name. Its armor layout, structural redundancy, and defensive armament reflected a fundamentally different approach to air combat than anything in Japanese experience. The examination would reveal not just technical differences, but philosophical divides about the nature of aerial warfare itself. Japanese aviation doctrine in 1941 prioritized offensive capability above all else. This philosophy permeated every aspect of their aircraft design, from fighters to bombers. The Mitsubishi, a 6M0, which had achieved air superiority over the Philippines and would dominate Pacific skies for months to come, embodied this approach perfectly. It was fast, maneuverable, and carried heavy armament for its size. It achieved these capabilities through ruthless weight reduction. The Zero carried no armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and minimal structural redundancy. Every kilogram saved went toward performance and firepower. This design philosophy was not accidental or born of ignorance. Japanese naval aviation had studied American and European aircraft development throughout the 1930s. They understood that armor and protection systems added weight. Their decision to forego such systems reflected a conscious strategic calculation. Japanese doctrine emphasized achieving air superiority through superior aircraft performance and pilot skill. The assumption was that well-trained pilots in superior aircraft would avoid being hit in the first place. Protection systems were seen as unnecessary weight that degraded the performance needed to win air combat. Japanese bomber design followed similar principles. The Mitsubishi G4M, which would become infamous to Allied forces as the Betty bomber, could carry substantial bomb loads over impressive ranges. It achieved this through the same ruthless weight reduction that characterized the Zero. The G4M carried no armor protection, used non-self-sealing fuel tanks, and had minimal defensive armament compared to its payload capacity. Japanese planners accepted these vulnerabilities as necessary trade-offs for the offensive capability that doctrine prioritized. The technical team that began examining the captured B-17 at Clark Field operated under these doctrinal assumptions. Led by Commander Wada Yoshito, the team included specialists in airframe structures, propulsion systems, and armaments. Their initial assessment, preserved in translated Japanese technical intelligence reports, focused on confirming expected American design characteristics. They anticipated finding an aircraft that prioritized payload capacity and range, likely at the expense of performance. What they did not anticipate was the extent to which American designers had prioritized crew protection and aircraft survivability. The first shock came when examining the cockpit area. The B-17's pilot and co-pilot seats were backed by armor plate. These plates, manufactured from face-hardened steel, were 55 hundredths of an inch thick and weighed approximately 75 pounds each. Japanese engineers measured and weighed these plates with evident interest. Their reports noted that this armor, positioned behind the pilot's seats, was angled to provide protection against attacks from the rear quarter, the most common fighter attack angle. The plates extended from just below the pilot's shoulders to above their heads, protecting vital organs and the base of the skull. But the pilot's seat armor was just the beginning. As the examination continued, Japanese engineers discovered armor protection throughout the aircraft in locations that reflected systematic analysis of combat vulnerabilities. The top turret gunner's position featured a curved armor plate that protected the gunner's back and sides while allowing necessary mobility. This plate was heavier than the pilot's armor, nearly 100 pounds, and was contoured to follow the gunner's probable positions during combat operations. The engineering required to form this complex curved shape while maintaining ballistic protection represented manufacturing capabilities that impressed the Japanese technical team. The B-17's bombardier position, located in the aircraft's transparent nose section, included armor plate protecting the bombardier from below. This placement initially puzzled Japanese engineers until they understood its purpose. American designers had anticipated that bombers might face anti-aircraft fire from below, particularly during the vulnerable straight and level bombing run. The floor armor, while it could not stop heavy anti-aircraft shells, would protect the bombardier from shrapnel and smaller caliber fire. This attention to specific combat scenarios, designing protection for particular tactical situations, represented a level of operational analysis that Japanese design practice had not emphasized. The examination of the B-17's fuel system revealed perhaps the most significant design difference. Every fuel tank was self-sealing. Japanese engineers carefully documented the construction of these tanks, which used multiple layers of rubber compounds with different properties. The outer layer was resistant to fuel while maintaining flexibility. Middle layers swelled when exposed to fuel, sealing bullet holes. Inner layers provided structural integrity. When penetrated by projectiles, these tanks would automatically seal holes up to 50 caliber in size, preventing fuel loss and reducing fire risk. The weight penalty for self-sealing fuel tanks was substantial. Each tank weighed approximately 30% more than a conventional non-sealed tank of the same capacity. Across the B-17's multiple fuel tanks, this represented hundreds of pounds of additional weight. Japanese engineers calculated these weight figures with obvious interest. Their reports noted that the Americans had accepted significant weight penalties to provide fuel system protection. This decision reflected design priorities fundamentally different from Japanese practice. Commander Wada's technical team paid particular attention to the structural design philosophy evident throughout the B-17. The aircraft's primary structure used heavy-gauge aluminum alloys with significant redundancy built into load-bearing members. Stringers, the longitudinal structural elements that gave the fuselage its shape and strength, were doubled in critical areas. The wing spars, the main structural beams that carried flight loads, were designed with multiple attachment points and load paths. This redundancy meant that the aircraft could sustain significant battle damage to its structure and remain flyable. Japanese engineers tested this structural redundancy by examining damage the aircraft had sustained before capture. The B-17 at Clark Field had been hit by several 20mm cannon shells from Japanese fighters during the attack. These hits had damaged stringers and torn through the fuselage skin in multiple locations, yet the primary structure remained intact. The redundant load paths had allowed the aircraft to redistribute stresses around the damaged areas. Japanese technical reports noted with surprise that the aircraft had remained structurally sound despite damage that would have been catastrophic to Japanese bombers with their lighter, less redundant structures. The defensive armament installation revealed another design philosophy difference. The B-17E model, the variant being examined, mounted 10 50 caliber machine guns in various positions around the aircraft. These positions were carefully analyzed for fields of fire that would provide overlapping coverage against fighter attacks from any angle. The top turret covered the upper rear hemisphere. The ball turret beneath the aircraft covered the lower rear. Waist gunners provided beam coverage. Tail guns protected the rear. Nose guns covered forward attacks. What impressed Japanese engineers was not just the number of guns, though 10 heavy machine guns represented formidable firepower, but the engineering that supported these installations. Each gun position included armor protection for the gunner, ammunition storage that could sustain extended combat, and careful attention to the gunner's ability to track and engage targets. The ball turret, which Japanese engineers examined with particular interest, represented a remarkable piece of engineering. It allowed a gunner to sit in a fully rotating, gyro-stabilized sphere beneath the aircraft, providing unrestricted fields of fire below and to the rear, while protected by curved armor plate. The weight and complexity of these defensive systems represented commitments of resources that Japanese design philosophy had rejected. A single ball turret assembly weighed over 1,000 pounds, including ammunition, armor, and mechanisms. The electrical and hydraulic systems needed to operate it added further weight. Japanese bombers, by contrast, typically mounted defensive guns on simple, flexible mounts with minimal armor protection and limited ammunition capacity. The difference reflected fundamentally different assumptions about the nature of bomber operations. American doctrine, as evidenced by the B-17's design, assumed that bombers would face sustained fighter opposition and heavy anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft was designed to survive in this hostile environment through protection and defensive firepower. Japanese doctrine, by contrast, assumed that friendly fighters would provide protection and that bomber speed and altitude would limit exposure to defensive fire. Japanese bombers were designed to maximize offensive payload and range, accepting vulnerability as a necessary trade-off. The examination of the B-17's oxygen system revealed another area where American designers had prioritized crew capability. The aircraft carried high-capacity oxygen bottles with redundant regulators and distribution lines. Each crew position had individual oxygen outlets with backup connections. The system was designed to sustain all crew members at altitudes above 25,000 feet for extended periods. Japanese engineers noted that this system, like everything else in the aircraft, included redundancy and protection features. Oxygen bottles were mounted in protected locations. Distribution lines were routed to avoid concentration in areas vulnerable to battle damage. This attention to crew sustainment at altitude reflected American understanding that high-altitude operations required comprehensive life support systems. Japanese bombers operated at lower altitudes where oxygen requirements were less demanding, and their oxygen systems were correspondingly simpler and lighter. The B-17's comprehensive oxygen system, with its weight and complexity, represented another area where American designers had accepted performance penalties to ensure crew effectiveness in anticipated combat conditions. Commander Wada's team discovered an interesting detail when examining the aircraft's electrical system. The B-17 used 24-volt electrical power rather than the 12-volt systems common in Japanese aircraft. This higher voltage allowed smaller, lighter wiring to carry the necessary current for the aircraft's extensive electrical systems. The B-17 relied heavily on electrical power for turret operation, bomb release mechanisms, radio equipment, and various instruments. The electrical system included multiple generators with automatic switching to maintain power if individual generators failed. Once again, redundancy and reliability were built into the design at the cost of increased complexity. The radio equipment impressed Japanese technical observers with its sophistication and power output. The command radio set could communicate over hundreds of miles, allowing formation, coordination, and contact with bases far beyond visual range. Intercom systems allowed all crew members to communicate clearly, despite the noise of 4 powerful engines. Radio compass equipment provided navigation capabilities that Japanese bombers lacked. This communications capability represented American understanding that coordinated operations over vast Pacific distances would require robust, long-range communication systems. Japanese engineers carefully documented the B-17's 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines. These radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, were remarkably similar in basic design to engines used in Japanese aircraft. Both American and Japanese aviation had developed air-cooled radial engines to high levels of performance, but the installation philosophy differed significantly. American designers had enclosed the engines in cowlings designed to optimize cooling airflow while reducing drag. Each engine nacelle included fire suppression systems, a detail that Japanese engineers noted with interest. The fire extinguishing equipment added weight, but could prevent the loss of an entire aircraft from an engine fire. The propellers warranted detailed examination. The B-17 used Hamilton standard constant-speed propellers with hydraulic pitch control. These propellers automatically adjusted blade angle to maintain optimal engine RPM under varying flight conditions. Japanese aircraft used similar constant-speed propeller technology, so this was familiar ground. But the examination revealed the typical American emphasis on redundancy and protection. The propeller control systems included backup mechanisms that would feather the propeller, turning the blades edge-on to the wind if an engine failed. This prevented a failed engine from creating drag that would degrade aircraft performance. As the examination progressed, Commander Wada's team began to understand that they were documenting not just individual protective systems, but a comprehensive design philosophy. Every system in the B-17 reflected assumptions about combat operations that differed fundamentally from Japanese doctrine. American designers had assumed their bombers would face intense opposition. They had designed aircraft to survive battle damage, protect their crews, and complete missions despite hostile action. These priorities had led to an aircraft that was heavier, more complex, and in some measures less capable than equivalent Japanese bombers. But it was also an aircraft designed to survive in conditions that would destroy Japanese bombers. The weight documentation compiled by Japanese engineers told the story in numbers. The armor plate throughout the aircraft totaled over 1,000 pounds. Self-sealing fuel tanks added approximately 800 pounds, compared to non-sealed tanks. Defensive armament, including guns, ammunition, and turret mechanisms, added roughly 3,000 pounds. Redundant structural elements contributed another significant weight increment. These protective systems represented roughly 10% of the aircraft's gross weight. In Japanese design philosophy, that 10% would have gone to additional fuel for extended range or additional bombs for greater offensive power. But the Americans had made a different calculation. They had determined that crew protection and aircraft survivability justified the performance penalties these systems imposed. The B-17 flew slower than it might have without armor. It carried less bomb load over shorter ranges than an unprotected aircraft of similar size could have managed, but it brought its crews home. This fundamental difference in design priority, protection versus performance, would prove to have profound implications as the Pacific Air War developed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Commander Wada's preliminary report on the B-17 examination, translated after the war from captured Japanese technical intelligence documents, reveals the team's growing understanding of American design philosophy. The report noted with professional objectivity that American designers had created an aircraft optimized for survival in hostile airspace rather than for maximum offensive performance. The report calculated that removing the armor, defensive armament, and self-sealing fuel tanks would improve performance significantly, allowing higher speeds, greater range, and increased bomb load. But it also acknowledged that such an aircraft would be far more vulnerable to fighter attack and anti-aircraft fire. What the report could not fully articulate was the strategic implication of these design differences. The B-17's protective systems reflected American understanding that a bomber that returned to base could be repaired and flown again. More importantly, crews that survived could pass their experience to new crews, building institutional knowledge and combat effectiveness. The aircraft's design accepted performance limitations to preserve the more valuable and irreplaceable resource, trained combat aircrews. Japanese doctrine, by contrast, assumed that performance and offensive capability would prevent losses. When Japanese aircraft were hit, their lack of protection meant they were often destroyed completely, taking their experienced crews with them. The technical intelligence gathered from the captured B-17 at Clark Field circulated through Japanese military aviation circles throughout 1942. Commander Wada's detailed report reached the Naval Air Technical Arsenal at Yokosuka, where it was studied by engineers working on next-generation bomber designs. It was reviewed by tactical planning staffs trying to understand American capabilities. It reached pilot training schools where instructors incorporated information about B-17 vulnerabilities into combat tactics courses. Yet, despite this distribution, the fundamental lessons about design philosophy and strategic priorities were not fully absorbed into Japanese aviation development. Part of this failure to adapt stemmed from industrial realities that Japanese engineers understood but could not overcome. Japan's aluminum production capacity was a fraction of American output. Every pound of armor plate added to an aircraft was a pound that could have gone to additional aircraft production. Japanese industry was already stretched thin, trying to produce sufficient numbers of aircraft to meet operational demands. Adding protective systems that would increase weight and complexity while reducing the numbers that could be produced seemed strategically counterproductive when quantity itself was becoming a critical shortage. But the failure also reflected doctrinal resistance to changing fundamental assumptions about aerial warfare. Japanese aviation doctrine had developed through the 1930s based on experiences in China and observations of European air combat. These experiences had seemed to validate the emphasis on performance and offensive capability. Japanese aircraft had dominated Chinese skies. The Zero had shocked Allied forces with its performance during the war's opening months. This success created institutional confidence that Japanese design philosophy was correct, and that American emphasis on protection represented a weakness born of inferior pilot quality and defensive thinking. The irony would become apparent as the war progressed. The very protective systems that Japanese engineers had documented with professional interest in 1941 would prove devastatingly effective in combat conditions neither side had fully anticipated. The vast distances of the Pacific theater meant that bomber formations often operated beyond fighter escort range. American bombers would have to fight their way to targets and back, relying primarily on their own defensive capabilities. The armor, self-sealing tanks, and heavy defensive armament that added so much weight to the B-17 became essential survival equipment in these circumstances. Japanese fighters attacking B-17 formations discovered that the American bombers were remarkably difficult to destroy. The armor protected crews from the most common fighter attack angles. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented the catastrophic fires that destroyed unprotected aircraft. The structural redundancy meant that B-17 seconds absorbed damage that would have torn apart lighter aircraft and continued flying. Most frustrating for Japanese pilots, the overlapping fields of fire from 1050 caliber machine guns made close-range attacks extremely hazardous. Japanese fighters, built for performance without protection, were themselves vulnerable to the heavy, defensive fire that B-17 formations could generate. The combat loss rates told the story in stark numbers. Early war, Japanese bombers like the G-4M suffered catastrophic losses when facing determined fighter opposition. The Betty earned a grim nickname among Japanese crews, the Flying Lighter, a reference to its tendency to explode in flames when hit due to its unprotected fuel tanks. By contrast, B-17 seconds regularly returned to base with damage that would have destroyed Japanese bombers. There are documented cases of B-17 seconds landing safely with engines shot out, control surfaces damaged, and large portions of fuselage structure destroyed. The protective systems that Japanese engineers had carefully measured at Clark Field were saving American crews and aircraft throughout the Pacific and in the skies over Europe. The strategic implications extended beyond individual aircraft survival rates. American bomber crews, protected by their aircraft's defensive systems, accumulated combat experience that made them increasingly effective. Formations developed tactics that maximized their defensive firepower. Gunners learned to coordinate their fire to create interlocking fields that were nearly impenetrable to conventional fighter attacks. This institutional learning was possible because crews survived to pass their knowledge forward. Japanese bomber crews, flying aircraft that offered minimal protection, suffered higher loss rates that prevented the same accumulation of operational experience. By 1943, Japanese aviation designers were attempting to incorporate some protective features into new aircraft designs. The Nakajima J-1N1 reconnaissance aircraft received limited armor protection after experiencing heavy losses. Plans were developed for self-sealing fuel tanks on next-generation bombers, but these modifications came late in the war when Japanese industrial capacity was already strained. More critically, adding protection to existing designs compromised performance to the point where the aircraft became less effective overall. Japanese engines, optimized for lighter airframes, struggled with the additional weight. The entire Japanese aviation industry had been built around the performance-first philosophy, and fundamental changes were difficult to implement. The examination of additional captured American aircraft reinforced the lessons from the original B-17 study. When a P-38 Lightning was captured relatively intact in New Guinea, Japanese engineers found similar emphasis on pilot protection and aircraft survivability. The P-38 featured armor plate protecting the pilot from multiple angles, self-sealing fuel tanks, and redundant control systems. A captured P-40 Warhawk showed the same design priorities. Even the supposedly obsolete P-40 carried armor protection that exceeded anything in comparable Japanese fighters. These examinations created a comprehensive picture of American aviation design philosophy that emphasized survival and sustained operations. Japanese test pilots who flew captured American aircraft provided additional perspective. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Nagai, who tested various captured Allied aircraft at Yokosuka, noted in his reports that American planes felt solid and reassuring to fly. The armor behind his seat created a sense of protection that Japanese fighters lacked. The controls, while heavier than Japanese aircraft due to the additional weight, felt substantial and confidence-inspiring. Nagai's reports, preserved in post-war archives, reveal a pilot's appreciation for design features that enhanced survival chances even as they acknowledged the performance penalties these systems imposed. The human cost of these design philosophy differences became tragically apparent as the war continued. Japanese aircrew losses mounted steadily as American defensive capabilities improved. Experienced pilots who had dominated early war combat were lost in increasing numbers. Their replacements, rushed through abbreviated training programs as Japan's situation grew desperate, flew the same vulnerable aircraft into combat against American forces whose crews were gaining experience and whose aircraft brought them home despite battle damage. The mathematical progression was inexorable. American aircrew experience levels increased, while Japanese experience levels declined. Individual stories illuminate the statistical realities. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's leading fighter aces, survived the war despite being severely wounded on multiple occasions. His memoir, Samurai, describes an engagement over Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, where he attacked what he thought was a fighter, but was actually an SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The rear gunner's fire struck Sakai in the head, destroying his right eye and partially paralyzing his left side. He managed to fly his damaged Zero 300 miles back to Rabaul despite his wounds, a feat of endurance and skill that became legendary. But Sakai acknowledged in his memoir that he survived largely through luck. Had the gunner's fire struck his fuel tanks or caused an engine fire, his unprotected Zero would have exploded. No amount of skill could compensate for lack of protection in that scenario. By contrast, American aircrews routinely survived damage that would have been fatal in Japanese aircraft. The B-17 Memphis Belle, which completed 25 combat missions over Europe and returned to the United States for a war bond tour, had survived numerous fighter attacks and flak damage. Examination of the aircraft showed battle damage repairs throughout its structure, holes patched in the fuselage, replaced structural members, evidence of hits that the armor had stopped. The aircraft's survival through 25 missions was not unusual for B-17 seconds. The protective systems enabled both the aircraft and crew to accumulate combat experience that made them increasingly effective. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan, which intensified in 1944 and 1945, demonstrated the ultimate vindication of American bomber design philosophy. B-29 superfortresses, which incorporated even more extensive protective systems than the B-17, conducted sustained bombing campaigns against Japanese cities and industrial targets. These bombers faced intense opposition from both fighters and anti-aircraft fire. They absorbed damage and continued operations. Japanese fighters attempting to intercept these formations suffered heavy losses to defensive fire, while often failing to destroy the bombers they attacked. Japanese engineers who examined downed B-29 seconds found that American designers had continued evolving the protective philosophy evident in the B-17. The B-29 featured pressurized crew compartments that allowed high-altitude operations without crew oxygen systems for most positions. Remote-controlled defensive turrets eliminated the need for exposed gunner positions. More extensive armor protection covered critical areas. Self-sealing fuel tanks of improved design prevented fire even from larger caliber hits. The structural design incorporated lessons from earlier combat experience, with additional redundancy in areas that battle damage reports had identified as vulnerable. The final accounting of aircraft losses throughout the Pacific War reveals the cost of design philosophy differences. Japanese combat aircraft losses totaled over 38,000 planes destroyed in combat operations. American combat losses in the Pacific were roughly 12,000 aircraft. While multiple factors contributed to these disparities, including industrial production capacity, pilot training quality, and tactical circumstances, the survivability built into American aircraft design was a significant factor. American aircraft that might have been destroyed continued flying. American crews that might have been killed survived to fly again. This compounding advantage, built into the fundamental design of American aircraft, contributed materially to Japanese defeat. The engineers who examined that first B-17 at Clark Field in December 1941 could not have predicted the full strategic implications of what they were documenting. They were technical professionals recording design details and calculating weight penalties. But they were also witnessing the physical embodiment of strategic philosophies that would shape the Pacific Air War. The armor plate they weighed, the self-sealing tanks they examined, the redundant structures they documented, These were not merely engineering features, they represented strategic decisions about the value of human life, the importance of institutional learning, and the nature of sustained combat operations. Commander Wada's technical report on the B-17 examination concluded with observations about American design priorities that Japanese doctrine did not share. The report noted that American designers had accepted performance compromises that Japanese engineering practice would not tolerate. This assessment was technically accurate. What the report could not fully articulate was that American designers had made these compromises for strategic reasons that Japanese doctrine did not recognize as valid. Protecting crews and aircraft for sustained operations required accepting performance limitations. American industrial capacity could produce aircraft in sufficient numbers, despite the resource-intensive protective systems. American strategic planning anticipated sustained combat over vast distances where aircraft survivability would prove decisive. Japanese doctrine, by contrast, had optimized for different circumstances. Performance emphasis suited campaigns where air superiority could be quickly established, where operations occurred within relatively limited geographic areas, and where industrial capacity limitations required maximizing offensive capability per aircraft produced. These assumptions had been reasonable given Japan's pre-war strategic situation and the campaigns in China that shaped doctrine development, but they proved catastrophically mismatched to the Pacific War's realities. The human dimension of these technical differences deserves reflection. Every aircraft represented not just metal and engineering, but the lives of the crews who flew them. American protective systems represented an institutional commitment to bringing crews home. The weight of armor, the complexity of self-sealing tanks, the expense of redundant structures, these were investments in human survival. Japanese crews, equally brave and skilled, flew aircraft where performance had been prioritized over protection. This was not callousness or disregard for life, but a different strategic calculation about how to achieve military objectives with limited industrial resources. Yet the outcome was that Japanese aircrews faced higher loss rates in aircraft that offered minimal protection when hit. The families who lost sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands on both sides experienced the same grief, regardless of which design philosophy had shaped the aircraft their loved ones flew. But the American families had better odds of seeing their aviators return home. The protective systems that added thousands of pounds to American bombers saved thousands of lives. This was not abstract engineering preference but concrete human consequence. Every crew that survived battle damage because armor stopped bullets or self-sealing tanks prevented fire represented families who would welcome them home, experience that would help win the war, and futures that would extend beyond the conflict. The story of Japanese engineers examining the captured B-17 illuminates broader truths about the Second World War in the Pacific. It was a conflict where industrial capacity, strategic vision, and design philosophy intersected with profound consequences. Japanese engineering expertise was sophisticated and capable. Their aircraft designs achieved remarkable performance through careful optimization, but they had optimized for the wrong parameters given the war they would actually fight. American designs, seemingly over-engineered and excessively heavy, proved optimized for the sustained, attritional conflict that the Pacific War became. There is tragedy in this story beyond the loss of life in combat. Japanese engineers understood what they were seeing when they examined that B-17. They documented the protective systems with professional thoroughness. They calculated the weight penalties and performance impacts. They transmitted this information through military channels where it could inform design decisions. Yet institutional momentum, resource constraints, and doctrinal confidence prevented the fundamental adaptations that this intelligence should have prompted. By the time Japanese aviation attempted to incorporate protective systems, it, was too late to alter the war's trajectory. The B-17 that Japanese engineers examined at Clark Field was eventually destroyed as American forces advanced through the Philippines. The technical reports those engineers prepared survived in Japanese archives and were translated after the war by Allied intelligence teams. These documents provide insight into Japanese understanding of American capabilities and reveal the design philosophy differences that shaped the air war. But the real legacy of that examination extends beyond technical documentation. It represents a moment when different strategic visions met in physical form, when engineering decisions made years earlier in design bureaus on opposite sides of the Pacific manifested their consequences in combat operations. The protective systems that seemed like excessive weight to Japanese engineers proved to be life-saving necessities for American crews. The performance advantages Japanese aircraft achieved through weight reduction became less decisive when their aircraft could not survive long enough to exploit that performance. The accumulation of small design decisions, each seemingly minor in isolation, combined to create systematic advantages that proved strategically decisive. This is perhaps the deepest lesson from the story of Japanese engineers examining American bomber design. Strategic success requires understanding not just current capabilities, but future operational realities. Design philosophies must match the wars that will actually be fought, not the wars doctrine assumes will occur. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.